It's been obviously fantastic, and she's been a little joy of heaven. But at the same time, it's a more responsibility looking after two little ones, especially when George is around. He's a little monkey. But no, it's fantastic having a lovely little family, and I'm so thrilled. And Catherine has been doing an amazing job as a mother, and I'm very proud of her.
What Princess Charlotte did at school that made Prince Louis to defend her. William's furious reaction. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the title points to something far more serious than a simple disagreement between children. According to the account at the center of this story, Princess Charlotte stepped into a tense school incident after a younger pupil was allegedly being mocked, and instead of walking away when staff intervened, she refused to stay silent. Then Prince Louis defended her, and that changed the entire situation. The detail that matters is what happened next. Charlotte was no longer simply the child who had stepped in to help. Another student allegedly blamed her for making the confrontation worse, leaving the adults to decide whether her actions had crossed a line. Louis, however, was not willing to let that version stand. His defense of his sister opened a door into something the adults had apparently not understood yet, and that is why William's reaction became the most important part of the story. The account claims that the school contacted Kensington Palace, expecting the matter to be handled as a question of discipline. But when William learned what had allegedly happened before Charlotte intervened, his concern reportedly turned into anger. The issue was no longer whether his daughter had broken a school rule, it was why she had felt she had to step in at all. Hi viewers, if a child in your family stepped in to protect someone who was being mocked, would you want them punished for speaking up?
Lionesses, want to send you a huge good luck for tomorrow. We're sorry we can't be there in person, but we're so proud of everything you've achieved and the millions you've inspired here and around the world. So go out there tomorrow and really enjoy yourselves.
Good luck, Lionesses.
Leave a simple yes or no in the comments, because that question sits at the heart of everything that follows. And if the idea of a child being blamed before the full story is understood bothers you, liking and subscribing is one small way of saying that the whole story deserves to be heard. The scene had already changed by then. Charlotte was at the center of a confrontation she had not apparently expected to become a disciplinary matter. Louis had placed himself firmly on her side, and somewhere beyond the school grounds, the information reaching William was beginning to look very different from the neat version an institution might prefer to present. There was another detail hanging over the incident. Louis had allegedly overheard something before the confrontation, something that suggested the tension involving Charlotte had not begun that day. The account claims that one student had been deliberately provoking her for days because of who she was. Even more troubling was the suggestion that someone at the school already knew about it. That possibility changes the entire shape of the story. If Charlotte had simply lost her temper during an ordinary disagreement, the situation would have been straightforward. Staff could separate the children, hear both sides, establish what happened, and move on. But if the confrontation followed repeated provocation, then Charlotte's decision to intervene becomes harder to understand without knowing what came before it. And Louis appears to have understood that distinction. He was not defending his sister merely because she was his sister. According to the account, he believed the adults were missing the reason she had acted. That made his intervention more than an emotional reaction. It became a challenge to the version of events taking shape around him. For Charlotte, the pressure was different. She was the child who had apparently tried to help a younger pupil, yet she was now exposed to the possibility of being remembered as the one who caused the disturbance. For Louis, watching his sister face that accusation created a choice. Stay quiet and let the adults handle it, or speak up about what he believed he had seen and heard. He chose to speak, and that decision would eventually bring William into the story. The first call to the palace was not supposed to become a royal crisis. School incidents involving children are normally handled quietly, away from cameras and headlines. But this was not an ordinary family, and the account suggests that the moment Charlotte became the subject of possible discipline, the situation acquired another layer. William was no longer hearing about a disagreement between pupils. He was hearing that his daughter had intervened, that his son had defended her, and that there may have been a history behind the confrontation that had not been fully addressed.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
A taste of a more modern king.
This is your mode of transportation.
It is right here.
William sharing with Levy the trials of last year when both his wife and father were diagnosed with cancer.
I'm so proud of my wife and my father for how they've handled all of last year. My children have managed brilliantly as well.
Catherine is in remission now.
Yes.
Yes, which is...
The silence that followed was not reassuring. It was the kind of silence that comes when adults realize an explanation may no longer be enough. The more Louis spoke, the harder it became to separate the confrontation from events that allegedly came before it. And that was what made William's next move so important. That was the point where the story stopped being about one afternoon. It became a question of who had known what, when they had known it, and why Charlotte had apparently been left to face the consequences of a situation that may have been building for days. The school had one version. Charlotte had her actions. Louis had his account, and William was about to hear the detail that could force him to question all three. If you think a child should never be made to carry the blame while the reason behind the incident is ignored, stay here, because the next part is where Louis reveals what he knew, and the story gets far more uncomfortable. The moment the younger pupil looked toward Charlotte, the atmosphere changed. There was no announcement, no dramatic warning, and no obvious sign that the afternoon was about to become a serious school matter. There was only a child standing apart from the others, visibly uncomfortable, while several students watched. Charlotte noticed, then she moved. What made her decision significant was not simply that she approached the pupil. According to the account, Charlotte challenged the behavior directly. She was not content to watch the mockery continue while waiting for somebody else to intervene. Her response was firm enough to draw attention, but the account does not describe her as attacking anyone. She was objecting to what she believed was happening in front of her. That distinction matters because the story later became focused on Charlotte's behavior rather than the conduct that had triggered it. The question shifted from why the younger pupil had been mocked to whether Charlotte should have involved herself. In a school environment, that can change the entire balance of responsibility within minutes. The staff response added another layer. Once adults moved toward the group, the immediate priority was to restore order. Students were expected to return to class, and the confrontation was supposed to end there. Charlotte, however, reportedly remained unwilling to simply walk away. She believed the younger pupil still needed attention, and that the matter could not be dismissed merely because the adults had arrived. That refusal created the first serious problem. From the school's perspective, the instruction was simple. The students needed to separate and return to their normal routine. From Charlotte's perspective, the routine itself appeared to be part of the problem. If the child who had been mocked was simply sent away while the underlying behavior remained unexplained, then nothing had really been settled. The disagreement became sharper when another student challenged Charlotte's account. The student allegedly argued that Charlotte had made the confrontation worse by refusing to leave. That accusation placed Charlotte in an awkward position. She could defend herself and risk extending the dispute, or remain quiet and allow the accusation to become the accepted version of what had happened. The account suggests she tried to explain herself. She had not stepped forward for attention. She had not been trying to create a scene. She had reacted because she believed another pupil was being treated unfairly. But once the accusation entered the conversation, the original incident became harder to isolate from Charlotte's response. That is where the situation began to attract serious attention from staff. The adults now had competing accounts. One involved the conduct directed at the younger pupil, another centered on Charlotte's decision to intervene. And somewhere between those two versions was the question nobody had fully answered yet. What had been happening before the confrontation? That question would become crucial. There were signs, according to the account, that Charlotte had been dealing with uncomfortable behavior before this particular incident. Nothing about that possibility could be established simply by looking at the confrontation itself. The visible argument showed only the final moment. It did not explain the pressure that may have been building beforehand. That was why Charlotte's refusal to retreat mattered.
With Eugene Levy.
Yeah, I think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of, doing the job and things like that, I don't feel too overwhelmed by that. Not now, anyway.
She was not simply refusing an instruction for the sake of defiance. She appeared, in the account, to believe that leaving would mean abandoning the issue. The younger pupil had become the reason she stayed, but Charlotte herself had also become part of the tension. The more the adults tried to close the situation down, the more important the missing context became. A school can control where children go. It can separate students. It can stop an argument. But none of those actions automatically explains why the argument began. If the cause is overlooked, the same conflict can return in another form. And this was precisely where Charlotte's position became complicated. She had done something that could be viewed as courageous by one observer and disruptive by another. She had challenged behavior that she believed was wrong, but she had also ignored an instruction to return to class. Both facts could exist at the same time. The real question was which one deserved greater attention. The account says that Charlotte did not receive an easy answer. Instead, the focus moved toward consequences. That shift would have been uncomfortable enough on its own, but the situation became more serious when Louis learned that his sister was being blamed for the escalation. He had not been the center of the original confrontation, yet he was close enough to understand that Charlotte's actions had a reason. He watched the adults discuss what she had done. Then he made it clear that he disagreed. Louis' position was not complicated. He believed Charlotte had stepped in because someone needed help. That did not automatically prove every detail of her account, but it meant the adults were no longer dealing with one uncontested version of events. For Charlotte, his support mattered for another reason. She was facing a situation in which her intentions could easily disappear beneath the question of whether she had followed instructions. Louis brought the missing human element back into view. His sister had seen someone struggling and had chosen to act. That decision had consequences. But it also revealed something about how the siblings responded when one of them came under pressure. The school could decide whether Charlotte's conduct breached its expectations. It could not so easily decide what motivated her. That required listening, and according to the account, the listening process had only just begun. The tension was therefore no longer confined to one exchange. It had become a question of interpretation. Charlotte's defenders could point to the younger pupil and the reason she intervened. Her critics could point to her refusal to follow the instruction immediately. Neither side could settle the matter without examining what had led to that moment. That is the kind of uncertainty that can make a school incident much harder to contain. A quick correction might end an ordinary disagreement. It cannot easily resolve a pattern of behavior if a pattern exists. And according to the account, that possibility was beginning to emerge. Charlotte had already taken the risk of speaking when staying quiet would have been easier. Now she was facing the possibility that the very decision that had brought attention to the younger pupil could also place her under scrutiny. Louis understood that something was missing. He was not yet revealing everything he knew. He was watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to speak. That silence was important because what he had overheard was not a detail about the afternoon. It potentially connected the confrontation to events that had happened before it. There was also a growing concern about the younger pupil. If the original mockery had been treated as a minor disturbance, Charlotte's intervention forced adults to look at it again. Why had the child been singled out? How long had the behavior been happening? Had anyone noticed before Charlotte stepped forward? Those questions were still unanswered. And while the adults were trying to establish what Charlotte had done, Louis was carrying information that could alter the entire interpretation of the incident. The most important detail had not come from the confrontation itself. It had come from something Louis had heard earlier. That information would soon force the adults to look backward instead of simply judging what happened in front of them. If this story matters to you because children should be heard before they are blamed, do not scroll away or stay silent now. Like, share, and subscribe, because the next part reveals what Louis knew before anyone realized how serious this situation had become, and that is where the story gets considerably worse. The room became quieter when Louis finally spoke. He had been listening while adults discussed Charlotte's behavior, but he had something they had not heard. According to the account, Lewis had overheard a conversation before the confrontation, and what he remembered did not sound like a harmless disagreement between students. It suggested that Charlotte had been dealing with deliberate provocation for days. That single detail changed the weight of his defense. Until that moment, the dispute could still be explained as a schoolyard clash that had become too heated. Louis's account introduced another possibility. If someone had repeatedly targeted Charlotte, then the confrontation involving the younger pupil might have been connected to a much longer buildup. The incident was no longer just about what Charlotte did in one moment. It was about what had been happening before that moment. Louis reportedly explained that one student had been making comments and provoking Charlotte because of who she was. The allegation was especially serious because it suggested the behavior was intentional. Charlotte was not simply caught in an accidental disagreement. Someone may have known exactly how to get a reaction from her. That possibility mattered because Charlotte had very little room for error. She could not easily respond to every insult or challenge without drawing attention. A normal child might walk away, argue back, or complain loudly. For Charlotte, every reaction could become another reason to criticize her. Her position made ordinary school tensions more complicated. Louis appeared to understand that. His defense of Charlotte therefore carried a different meaning. He was not merely saying that his sister was innocent. He was saying that the adults needed to understand why she had reached the point of intervening. According to the account, he believed the pressure had been building long before the younger pupil became involved. Then came the detail that made the situation considerably more troubling. Lewis allegedly knew that somebody at the school had already been aware of the behavior. If that part of the account was accurate, the responsibility question changed completely. It was one thing for staff to miss a single incident. It was another for adults to have noticed repeated provocation and still allow the tension to continue. That was the point where Charlotte's actions could no longer be examined in isolation. Her decision to step toward the younger pupil had already placed her under scrutiny. Now Lewis's information suggested there may have been an earlier pattern that deserved scrutiny too. The school could not simply ask why Charlotte refused to return to class. It also had to consider why she had become so involved in the first place. The account does not establish exactly who knew what or how much they knew. Those details remained part of the allegations surrounding the incident. But even the possibility was enough to make the situation more difficult for the adults handling it. Louis had effectively introduced a missing timeline. There was the earlier period of alleged provocation. There was the moment Charlotte intervened. There was the disagreement that followed. And there was the attempt to decide who should be held responsible. Those pieces did not fit neatly together anymore. For Charlotte, that could have been frightening. The story suggests she had already faced the pressure of being judged for intervening. Now her brother was bringing forward information that could expose a deeper problem. If the adults accepted his account, attention would inevitably move away from Charlotte's reaction and toward the conduct that allegedly preceded it. That shift was precisely what made the school situation more serious. The question was no longer simply whether Charlotte should have followed an instruction immediately. It became whether the adults had recognized the warning signs before the confrontation reached that point. And Louis had apparently noticed something the adults were now being forced to reconsider. His age made the revelation more striking. He was not sitting in a position of authority. He had no responsibility for school discipline. He was simply a younger brother who had heard something and believed it mattered. That created an uncomfortable contrast. Adults had procedures. Louis had a memory. The procedures had focused on the visible confrontation. His memory pointed toward what had happened beforehand. That does not automatically make every detail of his account true, but it explains why his statement could not simply be brushed aside. The missing context was now part of the discussion. The allegation about deliberate provocation also gave Charlotte's earlier behavior a different emotional dimension. Her refusal to stay silent could have been viewed as stubbornness. Her intervention could have been viewed as unnecessary. But if she had already been under pressure, her reaction might instead reflect a child reaching the limit of what she was prepared to tolerate. Again, the crucial issue was context. Without it, the adults could judge the final moment. With it, they had to examine the entire sequence. That was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for anyone hoping to close the matter quickly. Louis did not appear to be interested in protecting appearances. He was protecting his sister's account of what happened, and because he had allegedly overheard the earlier provocation, he had information that Charlotte herself might not have been able to provide. The story now had a second witness, not an adult witness, not a member of the school administration, her younger brother. That mattered because sibling loyalty can expose details that formal questioning misses. Louis knew Charlotte personally. He had seen how she behaved around him, how carefully she handled attention, and how unlikely she was to create unnecessary trouble simply for entertainment. His defense did not erase the possibility that Charlotte had broken a rule. It changed the question being asked. Was the rule violation the most important part of the incident? Or was it the fact that a child had allegedly been pushed into a confrontation after repeated provocation? That question was beginning to travel beyond the schoolyard. Someone had to explain why the alleged behavior had continued. Someone had to explain whether staff had been aware, and someone would eventually have to explain why the first response appeared to focus on the children caught in the confrontation rather than the circumstances that produced it. The account suggests that this was when the school realized the matter could no longer be handled as a simple disciplinary issue. A call to Kensington Palace became necessary. The call carried a straightforward message. There had been an incident involving Charlotte, another pupil, and Louis' intervention. But the information reaching William was about to become much more complicated. Because once the possibility of prior provocation entered the conversation, the question was no longer whether Charlotte should apologize. It was whether the adults had failed to see what the children had already seen. And that is where William's reaction began to take shape. The next stage would not be about a school rule. It would be about accountability. The timing of that call mattered. By then, the story had developed two competing narratives. One centered on Charlotte's conduct and her decision to intervene. The other centered on the alleged pattern that had preceded it. William was about to receive both, but the order in which those details were presented could determine how the situation looked. That is where institutional language could become dangerous. A report can describe a confrontation without describing the pressure behind it. It can record that a child refused an instruction without explaining why the child believed leaving would be wrong. It can identify who raised their voice without identifying who created the tension. Those omissions do not necessarily mean anyone acted improperly, but they can change the impression of what happened. Or had the adults failed to recognize why she became difficult in that moment? Or had he stepped forward because he believed his sister was being blamed for something she had tried to prevent? The answers were no longer sitting in the obvious places. They were buried in the details Louis had heard before the confrontation. As the report moved toward Kensington Palace, the stakes rose. There was no public statement, no cameras were waiting outside the school, no official announcement explained what had happened. The matter remained private. Inside the family, however, one thing was becoming clear. Charlotte had acted, Louis had spoken, and now William had to decide what those actions meant. He could treat the incident as a lesson in obedience and tell the children that school rules must come first. Or he could demand a fuller explanation and find out whether the children had been reacting to a problem that adults had underestimated. The next conversation would determine which path the story took, and somewhere in that conversation was the detail Louis had been carrying all along. If you believe children deserve to be heard before adults decide who is guilty, then do not let this story disappear quietly. Like this video, share it, and subscribe if you believe the full truth matters, because what William was about to hear would make the situation far worse. The call reached William before the school had any idea how far the matter was about to travel. What began as a private report involving Charlotte and Louis was now sitting on the desk of the man who had to decide whether this was simply a difficult school afternoon or evidence of something that demanded a much harder response. William did not have the luxury of seeing the scene for himself. He had the accounts being passed to him, the concerns raised by the school, and the information Louis had reportedly provided. That made the first question simple. What exactly had happened before Charlotte stepped in? The answer he received was not enough. The more William asked, the more the story appeared to separate into pieces. There was the younger pupil who had allegedly been mocked. There was Charlotte's decision to intervene. There was the accusation that she had escalated matters. Then there was Lewis' account of repeated provocation. Each detail changed the weight of the one before it. William's concern was no longer limited to whether Charlotte had followed an instruction. He wanted to know whether the instruction had been given after adults had properly understood the situation. That distinction became the center of the confrontation that followed. When William arrived at the school, there was no public spectacle. There were no cameras waiting at the entrance and no official announcement. The account describes a private arrival, followed by a meeting with school representatives. The atmosphere inside was reportedly tense because everyone understood that the conversation could no longer be treated as an ordinary disciplinary discussion. Charlotte and Louis were part of the concern, but the real subject was accountability. William wanted the school's explanation from the people responsible for handling the incident. He wanted to know what staff had seen, what had been reported, and what action had already been taken regarding the alleged behavior that preceded the confrontation. The answers mattered because discipline without context could produce the wrong lesson. If Charlotte had deliberately caused trouble, then she could be corrected. If she had intervened in an inappropriate way, that could also be addressed. But if she had been responding to repeated provocation, then treating her reaction as the entire problem would leave the original issue untouched. That was the point William reportedly refused to ignore. The school could argue that staff had to restore order. That was reasonable. Schools cannot allow confrontations to continue simply because students believe their cause is justified. They have a responsibility to separate children, calm the situation, and establish what happened. But William's questions were aimed at what came before that responsibility was exercised. Had anyone noticed the alleged pattern involving Charlotte? Had anyone spoken to the students involved? Had the younger pupil been properly protected? And if staff already knew there had been tension, why had it reached the point where Charlotte felt compelled to intervene? Those questions put the school in a difficult position. A disciplinary response can be straightforward when the facts are clear. This situation was not clear. The account contained competing interpretations, and Lewis had introduced information that appeared to challenge the simplest explanation. Then came the issue of Lewis himself. His decision to defend Charlotte could be described as another problem. He had inserted himself into an adult-managed situation instead of leaving the matter entirely to staff. If his response had crossed a line, that could not simply be ignored. But William's position was reportedly more measured than that. He could recognize that Lewis's intervention might have been imperfect, while still asking why the boy felt he needed to intervene. That question was uncomfortable because it shifted attention away from the visible behavior and toward the conditions surrounding it. The school was looking at what the children had done. William was asking what the adults had done. That difference drove the confrontation. According to the account, William became increasingly frustrated when the discussion moved toward the children's conduct without first resolving the alleged provocation. He was not arguing that school rules should disappear. He was challenging the idea that rules alone could explain what had happened. The concern was especially sharp where Charlotte was involved. She had not simply joined a dispute for entertainment. She had apparently believed another pupil was being treated unfairly. That did not make every choice she made automatically correct. It did, however, mean that her intention mattered. William reportedly pressed the school to explain why that intention had not received the same attention as the accusation against her. The room, according to the account, became increasingly uncomfortable. Charlotte's position inside the family meant that adults around her were aware of the unusual attention surrounding her. That did not make her immune from school rules. It did mean that any conflict involving her could attract assumptions before the facts were settled. The account suggests William was determined to separate those two things. He was not asking the school to overlook conduct simply because the child involved was his daughter. He was asking whether the conduct had been understood properly before consequences were considered. That is a crucial difference, especially when the incident involves children whose reactions can be shaped by pressure, embarrassment, fear, or repeated teasing. There was also the question of the younger pupil. If Charlotte had stepped forward because she believed that child was being mocked, then the younger pupil's experience could not become a footnote in the investigation. The child was the reason Charlotte had intervened in the first place. Any serious account of the incident, therefore, had to establish what had happened to that pupil, who had been involved, and whether the behavior had stopped. That made the meeting more complicated. William reportedly wanted the adults to consider every part of the sequence rather than selecting the moment that looked easiest to discipline. The beginning mattered, the escalation mattered, the response mattered, the aftermath mattered, and the children's voices mattered too. That did not mean accepting every statement without question. It meant allowing those statements to be examined before a conclusion was reached. The distinction was becoming important because the accusation against Charlotte had arrived before the full context was known. If that order of events was accurate, then the risk was obvious. The first version of the story could become the strongest version simply because it arrived first. William appeared determined not to let that happen. The school now had to answer questions that were harder than whether Charlotte had obeyed an instruction. It had to account for the circumstances surrounding that instruction, the alleged behavior that preceded it, and the information Louis said he had heard. That was pressure building inside the room, and it was about to become impossible to contain. A representative of the school could point to procedure. William could point to the children standing at the center of the problem. Both sides had legitimate responsibilities, but they were now approaching the incident from completely different directions. Then the discussion reached the subject of image. This was where the atmosphere reportedly changed. Any suggestion that Louis's behavior was especially embarrassing because he was a royal child would have touched a nerve. The children were not attending school as public performers. They were there to receive an education and live as normally as possible. For William, the idea that royal status should require his children to absorb mistreatment quietly would have been unacceptable. The account portrays his response as direct. The title of the story focuses on William's fury, but the anger was not simply about a father being upset with a school. It came from the possibility that his children had been placed in a situation where they were expected to manage a problem that adults should have identified earlier. That was the real confrontation, not royalty against a school, not a father demanding special treatment. A question of whether the same standards of safety and responsibility were being applied before and after the incident. William reportedly demanded a clear explanation of what had been known about the alleged provocation and when it had been known. He wanted the timeline, not a summary. That demand mattered. A summary could say Charlotte intervened. A timeline could show why. A summary could say Louis reacted. A timeline could reveal what he had witnessed beforehand. A summary could describe a disciplinary problem. A timeline could expose whether the problem had been building for days. And the more William focused on that timeline, the harder it became to keep the discussion centered only on Charlotte's actions. The account suggests that the school had to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The visible confrontation may have been the final stage of a problem that had not been properly resolved earlier. Still, William faced another decision. Protecting his children did not mean telling them that every reaction was justified. A parent can defend a child while still teaching that child how to handle conflict responsibly. That distinction was important. Charlotte needed to know that speaking up was not wrong. Louis needed to know that loyalty did not remove the need for judgment. And the adults needed to know that neither child should be left carrying responsibility for a situation they did not create alone. That was the balance William was reportedly trying to force into the conversation. The confrontation had now moved far beyond the original accusation. The school was being asked to examine its response. The alleged provocation was being brought back into focus. And Louis' testimony had become a central piece of the discussion. Then William asked the question that would change the direction of the meeting. What exactly had Louis overheard? Not what did Louis think happened. Not what did Charlotte tell him afterward. What had he personally heard before the confrontation? The answer mattered because it could establish whether the alleged provocation was random, repeated, or deliberately planned. For the first time, everyone in the room had to stop discussing the aftermath and confront the possibility that the most important evidence had existed before the argument ever began. That was the point when William's anger reportedly gave way to something more serious. The determination to hear the child's account without allowing anyone to dismiss it because of his age. And the next detail Louis gave was the one that could force every adult involved to reconsider what they thought they already knew. If that detail matters to you, do not look away now. Share this story, subscribe, and stay with it, because the next part goes straight to the revelation behind William's fury. And the truth Louis carried into that room could make the entire situation look very different. The answer Louis gave did not end the argument. It changed what the argument meant. If that account was accurate, then the confrontation was not an isolated moment. It was the point where a problem that had been building finally became impossible to ignore. The adults in the room now had a different task. They had to separate what could be established from what had only been reported, while still taking the children's concerns seriously. Louis could not prove every part of the story simply by repeating what he had heard. But his statement raised a question that could not reasonably be dismissed, had the warning signs been visible before Charlotte intervened. That question went directly to the heart of William's anger. The issue was no longer whether Charlotte had followed an instruction quickly enough. It was whether the school had understood the circumstances that made her act in the first place. A disciplinary record might describe the final confrontation. It could not, by itself, explain the pressure that allegedly preceded it. Charlotte's position became clearer in that light. She had seen a younger pupil being mocked and decided that silence was not acceptable. She had then remained involved after staff attempted to move the students along. That decision could still be questioned. Children are expected to follow instructions, and Charlotte was not exempt from that expectation. But neither was she required to accept mistreatment without being heard. That distinction appears to have mattered deeply to William. A parent defending a child does not have to claim that the child made every decision perfectly. The stronger position is to demand that the entire situation be examined. If Charlotte crossed a boundary, that could be addressed. If Louis handled his defense badly, that could also be addressed. But neither issue should erase the conduct that allegedly triggered their reactions. That was the standard William reportedly wanted applied. The most difficult question remained the alleged prior knowledge at the school. The account suggested that someone may already have known about the repeated provocation involving Charlotte. It did not establish exactly who knew, what they knew, or when they knew it. Those details would have required proper investigation. Still, the possibility was enough to explain why William's response became so intense. If adults had been aware of a developing problem and had failed to stop it, then the responsibility could not simply land on the child who finally reacted. The question would become why intervention had not happened sooner. That is where the story moved beyond Charlotte and Louis. It became a test of whether the adults around them were prepared to listen before assigning blame. The account portrays William as making that point forcefully. He reportedly challenged the emphasis placed on the children's behavior and demanded greater attention to the circumstances surrounding the incident. He did not want royal status used as a reason to give his children special immunity. He wanted the opposite. He wanted them treated fairly, with the same basic expectation that any child's side should be heard before judgment. That difference is important. The strongest version of this story is not that William wanted Charlotte protected from consequences. It is that he wanted the consequences to be based on the whole picture. That would also explain why Louis' defense mattered so much. Louis had not been the child at the center of the original dispute, yet his decision to speak gave the adults another perspective. His account forced them to consider information that might otherwise have remained outside the formal discussion. For Charlotte, the emotional effect could have been just as important. A child who believes she has done the right thing can become deeply confused when adults tell her that the same action was wrong. Without careful explanation, that confusion can turn into silence. The lesson becomes dangerous. Do not speak, do not intervene, do not draw attention to yourself. The family response described in this account points in the opposite direction. Charlotte could be taught that helping someone is valuable while still learning how to involve teachers safely. Louis could be praised for caring about his sister, while also learning that protection does not require reckless escalation. Both lessons can exist together. That is what makes the family moment more significant than the confrontation itself. Once the adults had finished discussing the incident, the focus could return to the children. The account describes William shifting from an angry parent confronting officials to a father reassuring his son and daughter. For Louis, that reassurance would have addressed a very specific fear. He had stepped into a difficult situation because he believed Charlotte needed him. If the response from every adult had been punishment, he could have learned that protecting someone was something to regret. Instead, the message could be more balanced. His instinct to protect his sister mattered. His judgment in a confrontation still mattered too. That is a lesson many children eventually learn, but it becomes especially important when the children involved are constantly watched and judged because of their family. Charlotte needed a similar message. Her intervention did not make her responsible for every consequence that followed. She could be reminded that courage and caution have to work together. Speaking up for someone vulnerable can be right, but doing so safely and with adult support is often wiser. That balance gives the story a more human ending. It also explains why the incident would matter beyond one school day. The royal family has spent years trying to give the children as normal a childhood as circumstances allow. The school environment is supposed to offer routine, friendships, lessons, and space away from the public spectacle surrounding their family. But privacy does not remove pressure. Charlotte can still be conscious of who she is. Louis can still be aware that people watch him differently. A younger pupil can still become the target of mockery, and adults can still make mistakes when trying to manage a difficult situation. The account therefore raises a broader question about how children connected to public institutions are treated. Should they be expected to remain silent because their reactions could attract attention, or should they be encouraged to speak when something appears wrong, while being taught how to handle conflict responsibly? William's reported response suggests where he stands. The welfare of his children comes before the appearance of perfect behavior. That does not mean rules disappear. It means rules should not prevent adults from asking why a child reacted the way she did. And that may be the real significance of what happened to Charlotte. She did not simply become involved in a school dispute. Her decision exposed the difference between controlling a situation and understanding it. Louis did not simply defend his sister. His statement revealed that the visible confrontation might have been only the final piece of a much larger problem. And William did not simply become angry about discipline. His reaction, according to the account, came from the possibility that his children had been left to deal with circumstances adults should have examined more carefully. That is why the story continues to attract attention. The most dramatic moment was never necessarily the confrontation itself. It was the question that remained afterward. Why did it reach that point? If the alleged provocation had really been happening for days, why was it not stopped earlier? If someone had already noticed it, why did Charlotte have to become involved? And if Louis had heard enough to understand what was happening, why had the adults not reached the same conclusion sooner? Those questions cannot be answered simply by deciding whether Charlotte was right or wrong. They require a complete account. The strongest lesson is therefore not that children should ignore rules when they believe something is unfair, nor is it that royal children should receive different treatment. It is that discipline without context can miss the problem it is supposed to solve. Charlotte's decision put the issue in front of everyone. Louis's defense forced the missing context into the conversation. William's reaction demanded that the adults look at what came before. And the children were left with a lesson that could follow them long after the school day ended. Speak when something is wrong. Listen when someone says they are being targeted. And before deciding who deserves blame, find out what happened first. For Charlotte, that may have been the most important part of the entire experience. She did not need to be told that every decision she made was perfect. She needed to know that doing the right thing was not meaningless simply because the situation became complicated. For Louis, the lesson was equally important. Loyalty can be powerful, but real protection requires judgment. Standing beside someone does not mean ignoring every rule. It means making sure they are not left alone when they need support. For William, the incident reportedly reinforced a principle that reaches beyond one school. His children are growing up under a level of attention most families will never experience. That makes ordinary childhood conflicts more complicated, not less. Every reaction can be interpreted. Every mistake can be amplified. Every accusation can become a story. The family's response, then, matters because it teaches the children what to value when pressure arrives. Image can matter, rules can matter, but fairness matters too. And if the account of this incident is accurate in its central details, that was the real conflict inside the school that day. Not simply Charlotte against another student, not simply Louis against a disciplinary decision. It was the struggle between a quick judgment and a fuller understanding of what had happened. That is why William's fury became the final turning point. He was not merely reacting to what his children had done. He was reacting to what they may have been forced to face before anyone understood the full story. The situation began with Charlotte refusing to ignore a younger pupil. It continued with Louis refusing to let his sister carry the blame alone, and it ended with William demanding that the adults responsible for the children's environment examine everything that had happened before reaching a conclusion. The question now is not whether every allegation surrounding this story will ever be confirmed. The important question is what the story exposes about pressure, responsibility, and the way children can become trapped when adults focus only on the final moment. Because once the noise died down, the children were left with something more valuable than a simple verdict. They had been heard. Charlotte had been given room to explain why she acted. Louis had been given room to explain what he knew, and William had made his position clear. Protecting his children does not mean pretending they can never be wrong. It means refusing to let them be judged without the full picture. That question remained at the center of the story. Charlotte stepped forward. Louis stood beside her. William demanded answers. And the unanswered questions surrounding what happened before that confrontation remain the part that deserves the closest attention. If you believe children should be protected from being blamed before the full story is heard, do not just watch and move on. Like this video, share it with someone who believes the same. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Your support tells this channel that stories about fairness should not be buried. Stay with this channel, because the next story coming here goes even deeper, and what happens next may be harder to ignore.